think this is a great question. And one thing I think is funny is that when you're asked this question in an interview, so you're interviewing to be a CTO and they're like, what are you going to do in your first 90 days? Like every person gives the same answers. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to really sit there. I'm going to listen and learn before I do anything. And every time you get this like kind of like very generic answer about like learning and listening first. And then, those people start.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Will Larson. He worked at Uber, Stripe, and now is the CTO of Calm. Wrote several books about engineering leadership, including Elegant Puzzle. And we're here today to talk a little bit more about engineering practices, engineering leadership, and so on. Thank you so much, Will, for taking the time to talk to us.
Of course. And thank you so much for having me. Excited to get to chat a little bit about a bunch of different topics, including edge leadership.
All right. Let's first go over a little bit about management and what makes a good manager. So you definitely had a lot of experience with top-notch companies, and now you're leading an engineering organization of one of the top companies in the Bay Area and in the world. What would you say makes a good manager?
This is a pretty open-ended question, so it's hard to give a really concise answer that people will agree with. But I'd probably come down to three things that are pretty important. So the first, I think, is experience, and there's no way to get around it. But management's a little bit of a profession where you get better by making mistakes, and so trying different things as well. It's not just mistakes that we learn, but trying different approaches, trying to communicate things in different ways, working with really challenging situations where maybe you don't get along with someone, and figuring out where your approach didn't work. So to me, the thing that really makes good managers is experience, and so it takes a little bit of time. The second piece, though, kind of within that, is that experience isn't necessarily valuable. I think practice is a really important part of becoming a better manager too. Trying different things, reading about different approaches. And so I think, having a peer group of other leaders and managers they can talk to, who can explain how they would approach a situation differently than you did. And then, finally, the third biggest thing I'd say is just like having the right motivations and interests. A lot of folks come into management thinking it is a promotion, that this is, like a great way that I'm going to get paid more or I'm going to be more important. These are terrible reasons to become a manager. Like you might get paid more, you might get paid the same amount, you might get paid less in the long run. But really coming in, trying to have an impact through and with your team, not because you think it's going to be like a way to get promoted or something like that. I think not that there's anything wrong with that, but if you really think about what makes a great manager, it's, to me, experience, deliberate practice, and then having the right motivations for how you're going about managing.
You mentioned about experience. Was there any counterintuitive practice that you've learned through time that benefited you afterwards that you took, later on? Or is there something that you did before that you've changed the way you manage through your experience as a manager?
So many experiences. And so one I'd say is that when I first started managing, I was at a strong point of view, kind of informed on doing like what was right for the team, what was right for the company, what was right for everyone involved, kind of like a morality. And that was so important to me that it often caused me to do things that I think weren't very effective for anyone involved, including weren't effective for actually accomplishing what I thought mattered. And so here's an example. Can remember at Uber pushing really hard on the CTO when I disagreed with a few of his decisions. And that didn't help him change his decisions. And actually this doesn't ever work, right? When you disagree with someone, there's a constructive way to kind of surface your disagreement, give them some perspective they might be missing. But also you have to go into that with some humility to recognize that you're missing a lot of context as well. And so that's like a good example of just having that humility to recognize that my perspective was probably missing, but I was also missing many other perspectives as well. And that made it possible for me to influence the folks around me. And so that That's an obvious one. But I can probably think of like 20 or 30 different things that I've done. And I think, a broader example of what I just described is I think about things, solving problems over rounds. So for example, early on, I'd see something I disagreed with, and giving a contrived example, maybe we said 10% of people had to be marked as underperformers each performance cycle or something. And so early on, like I thought the right way to solve these problems was like put my foot down. It's like, this is wrong. Like, we're never going to do this. I refuse. What I've realized is like often by the time these decisions are communicated to you as like a line manager, like they've already been debated 15 times, right? There's no room left in the discussion to actually change the idea. But you can probably be very successful at changing it for the next time they do performance. And so getting better at, instead of trying to like fight to change decisions when they were the hardest to change at the end of a given round, being more thoughtful about how to add my input, my perspective, my weight to change decisions over rounds. So for the next cycle, much easier. It didn't put me in conflict with folks. And I think even folks who agreed with, for example, getting rid of the stack ranking, the bottom 10% idea, they couldn't negotiate anymore either because the decision was made and final at that point. And so just being more flexible about accomplishing my goals rather than feeling motivated by like a moral sense of like justice or something. Even if I cared about the justice of it, I wasn't actually approaching things in ways that helped get them done. And I needed to be more efficient to actually accomplish the things that I valued.
You started, leading teams at Calm, and you led teams at Stripe as well. What would you say is what a VP of engineering and a CTO would need to do in their first, 90 days?
So I think this is
when they start.
I think this is a great question. And one thing I think is funny is that when you're asked this question in an interview, so you're interviewing to be a CTO and they're like, what are you going to do in your first 90 days? Like every person gives the same answers. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to really sit there. I'm going to listen and learn before I do anything. And every time you get this like kind of like very generic answer about like learning and listening first. And then, those people start and they don't do any of that. They just like start changing stuff immediately. So I think it's really funny to me that there's this like textbook answer you're supposed to give. And then like what everyone does is like totally different. And of course, like the ideal behavior is a little bit between these two. And so the reality is like when people are hiring a new VP of engineering or a new CTO externally, they're hiring this person because something is going wrong. Like you don't hire a new external CTO because everything's going really, really, really well. You just keep going with the team you have. Are there exceptions to this? There are rare exceptions to this. Your CTO has been with the company for 20 years and they're retiring. You do need someone new. Often you're going to fill that internally rather than hire externally, but there are a few exceptions. But typically when you hire a new executive, it's to fix something, and it's to fix something that's a little bit dire by the time you get there. Even if the company recognizes the problem early, by the time you go from realizing like, hey, we need a new CTO, to having that person start, that might be like a 6-month gap in terms of like interviewing the different candidates, like evaluating, getting them to accept, etc. So it's really hard to actually do, the textbook answer, like, hey, just going to listen and learn. Usually you've been told by the CEO, the board, or whomever, you need to fix something immediately. And so you can never actually do the textbook answer. That being said, the trick here is you do need to find a way to like do something valuable to address your biggest stakeholders, the CEO, the board, your peers, your team, but also learn what you should really be doing longer term. So I think, and I've written like a blog post on this. There's like a lot to kind of unpack in terms of understanding how does the tech stack actually work? Who are the actual stakeholders? Who are the people who are being underserved, kind of your stakeholders? So for example, oftentimes sales will say that engineering is doing a terrible job supporting them. And then as you dig in, it's probably something very specific and narrow, often just like one broken relationship or like a missing meeting. And then like they're much happier on the other side. So you have to like diagnose like all the kind of the signals you're getting, some of which will be accurate, some of which will be kind of, wrong. Like when customers bring feedback, it's there's a concern, it's not often the concern they actually state, right? And the same problem for executives is like figuring out from the stated concern, what's the actual concern driving the frustration. So you have to do all the diagnosis, but you have to find like one or two things to actually address to show impact to the CEO, to the board, etc. And in my experience, there's usually a few things that are really on fire that you just have to go after and kind of lean into. And so thinking about some of the experiences I've seen and that I've had, peers go into. Often there's some kind of social challenges where like often the CTO is getting hired because like a few people are working together exceptionally poorly. And I think those tend to be quite obvious quite early. And so that's something you can lean into and start addressing very quickly. Often there's missing relationships where just, two functions like engineering is just not talking to design at all, ever. And so there's kind of digging in to figure out what's happening there. So there's usually a few things you can figure out that will make sense, but really I think the challenge is you need to go broad to understand. You need to pick a few things to really focus on, and the two sins here are not learning. That's the first sin that leaders commit. The second sin is just waiting, because you really only have so long to get stuff done. You have to start doing something, but you have to make sure you don't do something thoughtless because you don't understand. How do you balance those two different ideas is kind of the core challenge.
Interesting. You remind me of Bob Iger. He became the CEO of Disney, and apparently he was talking to his wife, and he was trying to figure out, what to do. And his wife told him, "Look, you have so much time to fix the organization, so you should be bold." And I think they acquired Pixar or Marvel really early on, and it turned out to be a great deal for Disney at the time. But it is interesting that sometimes, like whenever there's a higher CTO, especially, there is definitely a problem going on. Most of the time there is a problem going on. So that's a great insight. So let's dig a little bit more into engineering organization and how they are doing. One of the things that might be important is to measure how they are doing overall. How do you measure? How do you compare an engineering organization? How do you know if they are doing well compared, to the best engineering organizations out there?
So this is a topic I've been thinking about a lot recently. And in particular, I've been thinking about it a lot because there are a lot of companies out there that are selling engineering effectiveness metrics. And so there's kind of this core pitch like, hey, your company's not as effective as it could be. Engineering could be doing a lot more work. Here's these dashboards that are going to help you understand how effective your engineering organization is. And if you kind of start following this idea, you start optimizing for it. You start reporting to the senior management team, to the board on engineering, effectiveness metrics. And I think it ends up in some really weird conversations where you might, for example, you might be discussing how long does it take for a pull request to actually get a review to get done. And then you have like a metric there about from how many working hours from the time that a pull request is open to when it gets reviewed. And then you're talking with like the CEO about how do we drive down latency between the PRs getting opened and PRs getting, feedback from the team. That's like probably the wrong conversation to be having with your CEO, right? Like that's like not really that useful. It's a great conversation to be having within engineering. But it's really like you don't necessarily need like the entire management team weighing in on that. And so as I've been thinking about that, engineering effectiveness metrics are really valuable, but often they lead to the wrong conversations with the wrong people. I've been thinking about we probably do a better job of thinking about who we're measuring for and what we need to give for each of those different stakeholders. So engineering metrics, like effectiveness metrics rather, I think of these as kind of metrics to optimize. These are really valuable, but they're mostly valuable within engineering for thinking about how do we improve our practices? Where should we invest? Should we improve our CI/CD build time, or should we address flaky tests that are having some stability issues? That's where these are incredibly valuable. And I want to be clear, I think it's extremely valuable to be measuring these engineering effectiveness metrics. I think it's even valuable to have a team dedicated to improving these metrics. What I want to caution people not to do is not to report these to your stakeholders as if this is what engineering does. This is not what engineering does. The value that engineering brings to the company is not fast CI/CD. That's just part of doing our job. That's part of our doing our job at a high quality level. That matters. But what engineering brings to a company is like our ability to actually ship like user-facing features and to operate the systems that already exist to support those features and the users kind of using them. And so to me, I had this idea of like metrics to plan and really just talking about the impact of the business. A lot of companies split metrics between like a product and a engineering group, where product owns kind of business impact and like engineering just talks about these efficiency metrics. But I really think that when we think about the impact of engineering, you should jointly own the business metrics with product as the base kind of default approach. Because then you and product are talking to the business about the impact that you're driving by building the product. Then you're probably also partnering with like whoever the business owner is, maybe also product in a smaller company, to talk about the value you're driving from operating the product. But those are really useful conversations. So when you talk about operating the product, it's like how many engineers do we need to support the SLA, the reliability SLA that we've committed to our enterprise customers. And so you could talk about like adding more engineers there. You could talk about like an investment project that's really grounded in the business. It's not abstract. It's not theoretical. It's like what does the sales pipeline show us, or what does the renewal pipeline show us about the impact of reliability and our commitments to kind of getting renewals for enterprise customers or something like that. Similarly, for product, it's like by kind of estimating potential impact for the work we could do. Here's how many engineers we think we'd take to do that work. And so this is why we should staff it. These are really useful conversations because these are the fundamental trade-offs that business needs to make. Like, do we want to invest our budget into operating at a higher standard or into building more product features? That's what the management team, that's where the board can like weigh in and give like valuable feedback. Engineering effectiveness metrics, that's just not the case. The board will never give you useful feedback on how to like be a more effective like developer workflow. That's just not what their expertise is. And so to me, splitting these two, I think, is quite important. And there's like more layers to kind of split apart, but these would be the biggest two that I see a lot of organizations get caught up on.
Very interesting. You worked at Uber, Stripe, and now you're the CTO of Calm. What are the commonalities and what are the differences that make great teams do well?
Good question. So thinking about just the different size of the companies, right? Like when I left Uber was around 2,000 engineers, and I want to say maybe 8,000 people in total. When I left Stripe, it was around, I want to say like 1.5 thousand engineers and maybe 3,000 employees or something. And then Calm today is about 350 people with about 100 engineers. So pretty different sizes if you think about it. Although Uber, when I joined, was not too much bigger than Calm is today. But I think like one of the core things that I think is interesting to think about for both is that in both of these, well, not both, all of these companies, what I've seen be really effective is like product design, engineering, working together, kind of joint ownership, and avoiding kind of, you see siloed companies where there are a product cycle, and they pass off like requirements or something. And I've just never seen that work very well for like moving quickly and building things that are like delightful and good. Because it's understanding the constraints of design, the constraints of engineering, the constraints of the product and business needs. It's solving those constraints together as opposed to incrementally or iteratively that you find something amazing. And so the first thing I think was really important for all of these companies is just partnering, working in partnership across the functions to build something great, as opposed to siloed functional thinking. And that's why I think at most of these companies, goals have really been the same goal at the top level across functions. And we evaluate design and engineering both on whether it's actually solving a user problem. not designing or not evaluating design on like the time it takes to get feedback on like a proposal or something like that. That's like the wrong way to judge design, really. Like you need to judge it on impact ultimately, the same as engineering, the same as product. So that's one. Two, just again, kind of on the engineering efficiency perspective, like all three of these companies also had teams like working on improving these engineering efficiency metrics underneath the hood. And so these are not the top line company teams, like the top line teams at the company are like solving user problems and building products and running infrastructure to support those user needs. But there was always like a small kernel of a team working on engineering efficiency. And I do think every company where engineering efficiency is, I think, like quite good, does have a small team that's just iteratively looking at, sending out the developer productivity survey every 6 months, understanding what the problems are, and making like the right one or two investments. If you aren't continually like sharpening the knife on engineering efficiency, it does just get very dull over the course of a year or two.
You mentioned different sizes of companies, and they are definitely in different stages, right? So Uber now is a public company, Stripe is a private company, but they might go public as soon as IPOs open up again, the market gets better, and now Calm is smaller. I've seen a trend though, and I might be mistaken, that companies are able to accomplish more with a smaller team. And that might be to the fact that the tooling has been getting better. So you have a lot of SaaS providers that provides a lot of tooling that, 10 years ago didn't exist. So one clear example is Stripe, right? Stripe handles payments. Before Stripe started, you had to do it all by yourself. Do you see a trend on smaller teams and more nimble teams in your career, or is that overplayed? And am I wrong here? I would love to learn more.
So first, I think your broader observation's right. Like when I worked at Yahoo and at Dig, like we were running our own physical hardware in our own owned or kind of leased data centers, and so that was took a lot of people to do that. I remember when I joined Dig, we had like a developer environment, but like it had broken, and the person who had set it up to like issue new developer instances like had left. So they didn't know how to issue developer instances anymore. And so literally they would find an engineer who had quit and then like give you theirs. So your developer instance at the point I joined was like some departed employee -02 or something. And you just use that because they couldn't give you a new one. And so this is the sort of thing that doesn't happen anymore in kind of newer companies, because the baseline like provisioning tools are not something that, like Jeremy wrote, like 2 years ago before he quit or something like that. It's like a little bit more standardized. But even Uber was not on the cloud. There are components of Uber on the cloud today, and that's been true for some years. But early Uber, up through 2016 or so, entirely running on its own physical hardware. And I believe the majority of Uber is still on its own physical hardware, although I wouldn't promise you that is true from like a majority perspective. But Stripe, on AWS, on the cloud for the vast majority of the spend, and Stripe is a huge beneficiary of that and a huge kind of purveyor of that simplicity as well, to your exact point. So at Calm, one of the core engineering values that we practice, this is the idea of, buy when it's not strategic. So if we don't think we're going to do something like exceptionally unique with an approach, we should just buy like a vendor that will do it for us ourselves. I think this is right. But also this growth has been a little bit the result of like the funding environment over the last like decade, where it's been easy to get more funding and to get funding like pretty cheaply. And so this means that companies are willing to invest into buying vendors or vendor tools that were, somewhat expensive, but were instant. They could just turn them on tomorrow and save them a ton of time to focus on whatever their core competency is. I think what we're going to see with the current recession is like more and more companies doing one of two things. one, the B2B vendors are going to get squeezed hard because there are all these companies that are basically going to negotiate with them this year and be like, hey, like we're running out of money, we're running out of runway. Either you drop our prices or we're going to stop using you. And so I think it's going to be like a rough time to be like a B2B vendor in the software space. And if these people can't negotiate the prices down far enough, they're going to say like, hey, we're just going to build it ourselves and do a terrible job, but it's a job that like that shows up in the budget in the right way, where they have dropped their vendor costs and they haven't grown headcount costs. I mean, they've implicitly shifted headcount off like new product development to actually like build a replacement, A/B test enrollment tool or whatever the case may be. But it doesn't read that way when an investor or the board is like reading their expense, their P&L statement. So I think that's going to happen, and I think that's going to slow down the the empowerment of small teams for existing companies. But I do think your broader thesis is right. If you look at what you can do today with like a retool or something like that, there's just like entire categories of tools that you don't need to build internally that just wasn't true 6 or 7 years ago. And so I think we're going to keep seeing this. I do think that the last thing I'd say here is just as an aside is that one of the challenges is I think we're going to see this approach get a little bit, is going to lose 5 years of progress is my guess, because you're going to see a lot of these vendors are going to like shut down because they can't raise funding and they can't get profitable. And so all these companies that have like built their entire stack on vendors are going to lose collectively like thousands of years re-implementing their own approach to these as their vendors start shutting down. So I do think, 20 years from now, like your point's going to be totally right. I do think over the last decade, it's definitely happened. I think the next 5 years, as a result of the funding environment, we'll probably see a little bit of a regression before it picks up speed again in the next funding cycle.
Interesting. What are you seeing at Com? Are you seeing pressure of reducing costs in B2B vendors? Are you dropping vendors? And as the recession goes in, and companies are trying to reduce, like don't have as much budget for SaaS vendors, for example.
I won't speak on a great amount of detail on this one, but generally speaking, I think it's important to think about Com and just like what is the product and what is the thing that we're trying to solve for, and how are we trying to help the companies that buy Com for their employees. And mental wellness is something that's still extremely top of mind for folks. There's nothing about the pandemic or the recession that has made mental wellness less important. In fact, I think that really it's become even more important, like even more acute of a need for the folks that are buying a product like Com. And that's where it's different than a product like, I don't want to name a product, but if you think about like a SaaS, like infrastructure product or something like that, those needs haven't gotten more dire. Whereas I think something like Com, I think increasingly relevant and important for the world out there. Definitely.
Interesting. So you mentioned a little bit about investing in technical infrastructure, basically, right? When what you saw in great engineering teams, they have a small team that is actually looking at metrics and whatnot. Do you set aside a budget? How do you exactly invest in that technical infrastructure?
I think finding the budget to invest in technical infrastructure is one of the interesting kind of challenges of being like the head of engineering at a company. And so the rational way to make this argument is effectively, hey, we're going to have 4 engineers, just a fixed amount, just 4. And then we're going to show how much they can increase the productivity of the other engineers at the company. And then from there, we can figure out the true size. Or, for example, if these 4 engineers double the productivity of the company, then you should invest a lot more there. And so that's kind of like this theoretical argument where we can show the project list, you can show the amount of effort it takes to complete them, you can show the impact on productivity, and then you can be like, hey, we can do, if we had 50% developer productivity, we would like quadruple the productivity at the company. Like this is sort of the theory. This argument never quite works. I think this is like a bit of a theoretical argument, and it doesn't really land. And I think it's like kind of like flawed as you get into it. There are diminishing returns in terms of the actual numbers of projects you can do that will significantly increase productivity. And so to me, I think starting for a small company, start with a fixed amount. I think it's pretty easy to make the case that you want to have 4, 5 people working on this on a full-time basis. And you can get that like hidden in the budget, I think, pretty easily by the time you have like 50 engineers at a company. And that's, very, very much what Calm did. We like decided to have a small team called Product Infrastructure that did exclusively developer productivity work. And then we just kind of codified that in the budget, and we've kept that pretty constant over time. The other strategy that you see used a lot is like deciding on like a ratio. Typically, this would be for a larger company, not like a 50 or 100 engineer company, but like a 500, 1,000 person or 1,000 engineer company, where you have like a ratio between developer productivity, infrastructure, and kind of product engineers. And so you might have like 1-to-4 ratio between people working on infrastructure and developer productivity and people working on product engineering. I think something like that is also pretty reasonable as like an initial kind of rule that people can roll out. The thing I'd say is like for all of these rules, headcount allocation is like more about like just trust between the parties doing it. I think when people want to find out like rules that will be like encoded permanently for how we do resource allocation, it's just like not actually how the process works. Like how the process actually works is that there's like 7 execs like arguing in a room about like where the budget should go, and you have to convince each other, and like each one of them understands the efficiency of their function very deeply and the efficiency of the other functions like a little bit superficially. So you never get to the rational place for any of the functions. You get to a somewhat rational place across all of the functions, and that's kind of the best that these processes can actually do in my experience. But to me, I would start with a fixed allocation of a small amount. Easiest to justify, easiest to maintain. No one even cares about budget that stays flat. That's like sort of an exaggeration, but mostly true in these discussions. It's kind of an argument about the areas of growth. Then kind of pin like a ratio between product and non-product engineering. And then beyond that, you actually have to make a per project argument on a case-by-case basis, which is much harder, particularly in that room where the decision's actually getting made.
Interesting. Talking about infrastructure a little bit, you mentioned that Uber had their own servers, which is interesting, and they're moving to the cloud. One trend that I may be seeing, and I also would love to hear your opinion there, is that we're moving towards more and more abstraction. So what I mean by that is that you would manage your server, and then maybe you have VMs, and then you have Docker and whatnot, and eventually you might run everything on serverless functions or something like that. Is that right? Are we moving towards a more towards more abstraction? And do you think that's the right trend, or are there blockers, or are there pros and cons between some of these options?
Yeah, my sense is that these things are heavily trend and kind of popularity driven. And so, for example, if you look at like some of the early Google Cloud offerings, like the very first ones, it was basically like a platform as a service. You'd only write Python. You like uploaded an app in like a specific directory structure, and it ran it for you. But you had no visibility into the servers. You had no visibility to anything. It was effectively like serverless, right? You didn't have any access to it. And this was, I mean, I could be wrong, but this was like definitely by 2010. This is out there, and I think like early versions of Snap I think ran on this system. This existed, and then you look at like serverless today, and you're like, man, like this is very similar. They've changed the routing between like the incoming like edge and like how it gets to the function. So there's some differences, but it's like not really that different. You could have implemented serverless as it's described today on the tech stack of a decade ago. But then there was kind of this detour, right? Where like, hey, there's all these limitations of these kind of the PaaS approach, and so they went down containerization and like et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there's always like a bit of a trend. It's similar to like when Ruby on Rails came out, and there's this love of magic, and then there's this reaction and more of like a Sinatra kind of like focus where they wanted less magic and like more kind of declarative, more control. I think this is like going to continue to generally be true, but with like a slow arc towards kind of like more abstraction. You know, one of the things that is like not talked about a ton, but I think is like really important, is that like there hasn't been like a fundamentally like domain changing technology that's like taken off in the last like decade. And there was a lot of hope that, you know, Web3 and crypto would be this like domain changing like technology coming out. But I think we haven't really seen that. If you think about the rise of mobile, you think about the rise of the internet, these like completely changed everything. All the abstractions broke and fell away because they just didn't work the same way. And so, you know, you would presume that we'll have another like kind of paradigm breaking technology coming at some point that will like pierce all the abstractions again, because we just don't know how to run or write software on top of that abstraction. Not a ton of evidence that's happening yet, but you would just assume historically that will be coming at some point and soon. It'll be interesting to see what that might be. But in terms of these kind of stacks that we understand because we've been building on them for like a decade, or from like a mobile perspective, like a decade plus, and then from like an internet perspective, many years at this point. I don't know, is it like 50 years of internet now? Getting close. The abstractions are going to keep improving for sure on those as they become mature.
Yeah, let's hope that smart contracts actually, get deployed and more used. The Uniswaps of the world. We'll see if that trend actually takes off, or if it was just a small wave. Interesting. Let's move on to a little bit more about the teams and how to manage them and manage energy. So in one of the blog posts, you mentioned how managing energy is important, right? What do you mean by energy, and like why do you think it's important to manage the energy of a team?
So something I noticed early on in my career is how much time I spent trying to get the right thing to happen. And so how, we're not evaluating the right people. We might only be evaluating referrals for new roles. And so how do we make sure we evaluate the best people in the world, not just like our friends that we already know when we think about hiring our next software engineer or whatever for the team. And I found that I picked up all these causes that were important to me that I think were like moral points. And I think I are still things I agreed with, but I realized like left me kind of empty of energy at the end of it. And where I'd kind of been so focused on pursuing these things that felt really important to me and still feel important to me, but I actually didn't have any energy to kind of see them through to completion. And I didn't really have the energy to do all this other stuff I needed to do as well. And so I was frustrated. I was angry. I was like, how do we become more just, more virtuous, like leaders in these companies that we're responsible to be? And by not picking my battles the right way, I just ran out of energy. And so I've been thinking about this idea of like energy management for a long time. And how do we, people who have a really strong kind of moral drive often run out of energy in the first year at the companies they're at. And then they're burned out. They either are burned out or they're perceived as burned out or whatnot. But how do we actually accomplish these things that really matter to us a lot in ways where the companies actually change and grow and improve based on like our perspectives and what we know and what we feel strongly, as opposed to being a flash in the pan where we show we're like frustrated and then the company doesn't actually improve or gain anything from us. And we also don't understand the company. We don't understand the context that we're in. And there's like an arrogance to coming in and kind of saying like, hey, my perspective is the dominant, correct perspective. the existing perspective is baseless and wrong. You have to understand kind of all of it and then find like the path forward that brings these different views and values together in like in a good harmonious way. And so to me, I've been thinking about this and thinking about, hey, sometimes there's stuff that you want to take on that if you take on, you're just going to run out of energy. And just being more thoughtful about, hey, where do I actually have the time to take things on? And so I've become like vastly more selective in terms of like the improvements I want to make to the company that I work at. In terms of, it's not just it's not like, hey, I'm lazy and before I worked hard and now I'm lazy. It's like, hey, I'm only going to take on the work that I can finish. And so this is a little bit like doing like a big software infrastructure migration. It might look like a really productive if you start like 50 different migrations. Hey, we're going to migrate to Kubernetes. Hey, we're going to migrate from Python to Go. Hey, we're going to migrate, all these different things. But if you don't finish them, the company's actually just like worse off, right? You've created like a lot of like turmoil, a lot of confusion, but like no one's actually better. You've actually just made things worse. It just feels very productive to start things. And I think recognizing like where are the places where my desire to feel productive has actually harmed the companies, the teams, the organizations I've been part of. Instead, rethink like, okay, if I think about my goal for a migration, finishing the migration, like actually running on Kubernetes, not having like two things on Kubernetes, and reason backwards, like what do I need to do differently? And to me, it's, only starting things I can finish and making sure that I actually have enough energy to see those things through. And that's like made me happier. It's made like the companies I work with, the teams I work with happier. For the most part. I mean, sometimes people will always be upset that you're not working on the thing they care about. But I think, similar to like whether it's a technology pattern where they hate Python, they want you to move to Go, or whether it's a social pattern where they're upset about how you do performance reviews and they want you to move. Starting the change without finishing it doesn't actually help anyone. And that's been, if I had to have like one idea that's transformed kind of like my approach to management, and I think made me and those I work with a lot happier, it's really that one.
Interesting. So you mentioned hiring the best people and, how it's important to find the best people in the world, not only the ones that are in the social network of the workers of that company. How do you think that impacts how remote impacts that? And do you see what do you see the trade-offs between remote and in office, and what are your views there?
I talked a little bit about like the move to from PaaS to kind of like containers to like serverless and the trendiness component to it. And I think that there is like a heavy like trend component to, the forced move to remote from the pandemic. Like companies that were not well set up to actually go remote were just forced to go remote because it was like a safety conditions essentially. And now, some of them are really struggling to be effective remote because they didn't change their practices. So if building relationships in your company always depended on like getting in a room and interacting together, and you never found a different way, man, you're not going to be a very effective company. There are other companies that I think GitLab's a good example that was remote before the pandemic, has been remote through the pandemic, and is still remote. And I think that they did not have to change how they work much really at all because they already had these existing patterns of working that way. And so to me, I think this idea of like remote versus not remote is not quite the right question. It's like a company that actually is deliberately remote and has built the practices to succeed that way versus companies that were kind of like forced to be remote and aren't that effective as a result if they've not done the work to actually succeed as a remote company versus just like patching it over, hoping that their old patterns will work well. And so a lot of informal communication, a lot of one-on-one communication, having a limited like written and documentation culture. These are all things that a lot of like in-person companies have. And if they haven't found alternate ways to solve those that work better remote, those companies are struggling. Ultimately, this like desire to have all companies work in one way or like one approach is the best for all companies, I just think it's like a little bit like overly simplistic. Like the reality is companies are made of people. People can succeed in lots of different ways. it's like not that important that we have like one standard way of working. Like who cares? There's many ways to be successful, and there always will be.
Interesting. So talking about a little bit of strategies, you mentioned how, for example, GitLab has a really big culture apparently of writing docs and really big culture in writing. Are there engineering strategies that you see working well in different companies? So maybe that means, designing docs and things like that?
I think so engineering strategy is like such a kind of an overloaded idea, where I think like really any document about engineering can be described as an engineering strategy. And if you talk to CTOs, there's often this like sense of like dread where they're like, hey, they're asking me for this engineering strategy, and then like you're like, what do they actually want? And then it might be like what is the technology choices and how do you pick a new technology? It might be how do we form teams? It might be how we actually like a planning structure. And all of these will be kind of like grouped into like a technology or an engineering strategy. So first, I find the term incredibly like tricky to kind of parse because it's just used in so many different ways at so many different companies. And it could mean like anything. It's just like something related to engineering that is also something related to a strategy. And strategy is like, again, a word people use to mean like literally anything they want it to, that there's very few people who agree on what a strategy is. So first there's kind of that, like, who knows? What I will say is like where I found strategies, like, well, engineering strategies to be useful is to basically find things that cause a lot of conflict over time. Like not even conflict and like people are upset, but just like a lot of debate over time, and then look at how the company makes the decisions, and then document that just to prevent kind of future disagreement. And so particularly on things where being consistent matters. And so there's a lot of things where being consistent doesn't matter that much. So as sort of a superficial example is that if you don't document things very well internally, then how you document your next project internally doesn't matter that much because no one's going to read your documentation anyway. But if you have an amazing internal documentation culture where there's like a good internal search for your docs, then documenting in a way that's actually going to work with the internal search, that's consistent with all the other documentation, that matters a lot. And so it's not even the case that like certain things do or don't matter. It's really context specific. But a good example, again, of something that matters, where consistency matters, is looking at your different programming languages and not introducing ones that require like a new build or like a new lint system or something like that. And so you probably have like a complete CI/CD process that works with Python or with Go or whatever. If you introduce Scala, then this is a totally different build system, totally different dependencies, totally different documentation. Introducing that's incredibly expensive, and it's expensive in a way that's like a little bit hard to see from the engineering perspective. But for example, all your security controls thrown out the window, all of your compliance controls thrown out the window, and all your build optimizations thrown out the window. And so the actual cost to make some of these changes is very expensive. So to me, when we look at engineering strategies, it's like, what are the places where inconsistency is expensive and where you've had like a lot of discussions about inconsistencies in the past, and just documenting those to avoid having more discussion on it. And so, like I mentioned before, at Calm, one that we documented was this idea of using vendors when it's not strategic, when the function's not strategic. So for example, for A/B test enrollment, like critical capability, but there's a lot of great vendors out there that will already do this. And so we don't need to build something ourselves from scratch. Event collection, similar case. And just thinking about that has saved us many months of debate about whether we should or should build it ourselves, not build it ourselves. This just kind of ends the conversation. But we didn't get there immediately. We went through 4 or 5 of these debates about different topics and kind of decided to standardize here. So this is where I would love people to use engineering strategies as a look at a debate where consistency really matters, where you've had a number of kind of precursors, debates around it. Just find the answer, document it, move on.
And that's a great point. Yeah, thank you for giving clarity there. When we look at engineers inside the team, there's this goal of many engineers to get into a staff engineer position, right? What do you think makes a great staff engineer?
So a few years ago, I was able to publish Staff Engineer, the book, and did a bunch of interviews with folks who were operating in staff engineer roles. And, I had a couple of different goals with that book. One, like, I was having trouble giving advice to folks about what they should actually do to pursue their career goals. And two, like, I thought there was like a little bit of confusion for the teams themselves about what staff engineers were and weren't. And so I wanted to figure out, how do we just document like how different companies are actually doing this and kind of pull that together. And I think interestingly that a very frequent complaint about the book is that it doesn't have I write a ton of code staff engineer. And this is actually one of the reasons I wrote the book, and I wrote the book the way I did, is that like I personally don't think that there is a staff engineering role where you write a ton of code and that's the primary contribution. There are companies where there's like kind of the edge case where there could be a domain expertise in like networking at the OS level or something. There are companies that are doing things that are so technically complex and require a level of detailed expertise that I do actually think that the staff engineer works there. But most companies that you look at, like most startups, aren't actually doing work at that level of complexity and detail in the domain. They tend to be doing relatively straightforward work from a technical perspective that, many other companies are doing comparable technical work where it's not inventing a novel solution. It is, working through the requirements, working through the stakeholders. That is the actual innovation that's happening on a lot of these projects. And so that's the point of view that I have in the book. And I think, any successful book will have people who disagree with it. Like that's, I think, part of the goal of doing this sort of work is driving a conversation around it. But the first thing I say is like that what a staff engineer is like what the company needs to accomplish its business. And so at most businesses, what a staff engineer is someone who can coordinate many different efforts and to help kind of work with your cross-functional partners, the different teams who are disagreeing about approach to find a path forward. What a staff engineer is not is like what you personally want it to be, which is in many cases for many engineers. They want a low coordination role where they get to do the same work as a senior engineer, but have like more respect, are paid more, and get more autonomy. That's like often not like a role that's available at most companies. It certainly, can exist, and some companies will use titles in like arbitrary different ways. But there's no like certifying agency that says like staff engineer at every company needs to mean like this or that, right? It's, companies make stuff up. And, a staff engineer at one company will actually be a senior engineer at another company, right? Like even leveling is like very inconsistent across companies as well. But I do think that people kind of project what they want these roles to be a little bit onto it. And that's why I wrote the book in particular. And I think Tanya Riley has an amazing book out as well. Very, very similar kind of like focus area, although like a very, very different book. And I think worth reading both. But these are different jobs at their core. Like this is not just being a software engineer. This is like a leadership role that does slightly different work with slightly different focus. Also requires your expertise from being a software engineer. But I really, when people are like, hey, like you've missed this one, it's like, absolutely not. This is a deliberate omission. Trying to get people to think about whether they're just wanting that role to exist or whether it actually is a role that the business needs to exist for itself.
Great. I highly recommend Will Larson's Staff Engineer book, and also Elegant Puzzle. It goes over, the structure of teams, how many people ideally should be formed, things like that. That are really, really important for people that, want to understand a little bit more how to manage teams really well. And Will has experience in the best teams in tech in the world. So Will Larson is the top person to ask about these questions, and definitely his books are amazing at that. Question related to books. Is there a book that you would recommend for engineers or managers to take a look besides Elegant Puzzle? Obviously, everyone should buy Elegant Puzzle, but is there another book that you would recommend, or is there a book besides in management that you would recommend to folks out there?
I do a lot of reading. I think it's hard to be an author without doing a lot of reading, but I also think it's hard to be like a good manager or like good at really anything without just like consuming a bunch of ideas. So if I think about books that have been really transformative for me, like the number one would be Thinking in Systems, a primer by Donella Meadows. I think really foundational book in systems thinking. I think a lovely book, a quick read from like a real pioneer in this space. There's a ton of other ones, right? But one book that I personally found valuable was Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values and Frame the Debate by George Lakoff. I read it, maybe 20 years ago. But it just really focuses on this idea of like framing ideas and how important that is to have successful discussions and debates. That really changed how I think about communication in terms of kind of arguing, in terms of trying to change the perspectives in the room. I think that one was incredibly valuable. And then, ton of classics like, Peopleware, Slack, Mythical Man Month, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, 5 Dysfunctions of a Leadership Team. Like it can go on and on there. But really, if I were to kind of give 2 that I think are really valuable books that I've taken a ton from, Thinking in Systems, a primer by Donella Meadows, and then Don't Think of an Elephant by George Lakoff were both like really phenomenal books for me.
Awesome. I will add the links of your books to the YouTube video and also to these other videos that you recommended. I really recommend the Elegant Puzzle, and for engineers that want to get to a staff level, the staff engineering book. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I've learned a ton, and I bet viewers will also learn so much. Thank you, Will, for your time, and have a lovely day. And yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. You too.